Alright guys, welcome back to Formula 1 News. Another critical day in the context of this year's World Championship. The drama continues at the front end of the field. McLaren brought an upgrade to Interlagos and it seems to have delivered in spades. Verstappen could get nowhere near the lap times, run a relatively short lap of both Lando Norris, but also Oscar Piastri. What a performance from him just when Lando Norris arguably didn't need it. But Sergio Perez out again in the early part of qualifying. Not all his fault today, but the drama with Liam Lawson in the search for that second seat at Red Bull next year certainly continues. So much as ever to get into today. Very much interested in your thoughts in the comments below. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always. I'd greatly appreciate it. Of course, we're also going to talk about this man, Ollie Bearman, on the left-hand side. A Haas driver for next year. And currently, a Haas driver, Kevin Magnussen, may be going to Sauber next year. This was an interesting rumour that emerged today. We know how good Nico Hülkenberg is in that car, and it looks like Sauber are considering, under Audi, reuniting this year's Haas lineup at Sauber next season. Magnussen's been doing a better job alongside Hülkenberg over the last few rounds, and arguably has started to prove that maybe, yeah, he does deserve another drive in Formula 1. Seems unlikely. The opportunity, of course, this weekend, a circuit that he's gone pretty well at in Interlagos, of course, sprint pole here back in 2022, to run it back and prove he had a good weekend. Not got the opportunity to do that, as we shall see in a second. However, Gabriel Bortoleto, who was heavily rumoured to be going to Sauber, McLaren Jr., of course, apparently is going to part ways with McLaren, which seems to open the door to only one thing, to get that potential drive at Sauber going into next year. The feeling is that Colapinto, if he's going to go anywhere, it's going to be Red Bull or RB or Racing Bulls or whatever, because they seem to be interested, and even if Sauber are interested in Colapinto, if I'm Colapinto, I'm not even sure I'm going, to be perfectly honest. I think I'd prefer to be a Williams reserve and bide my time for what will be another opportunity that I'm sure will arrive at some point. But yeah, unfortunately for Kevin Magnussen, today he was unwell, and therefore, Ollie Bearman is back in the car again. I mean, it's kind of a fascinating season that he has had in the Ferrari for Sainz at the start of the year in Saudi. Scores points in the car for Magnussen right after his race ban back in Baku, scores a point at the end of that Grand Prix, and back in the car again today. So we know he's getting the drive anyway. So on some level, the pressure wasn't really on Bearman because he knew he was getting the drive, obviously, but still pressure to hop in last minute and deliver. This was also noted. This is Christian Horner leaving the Williams hospitality, and obviously he's got to look at the media and say, what's going on here? So what else could this potentially be, other than presumably some sort of conversation with James Vowles and Williams about the potential availability of the man in the background, Franco Colapinto. That is at least the theory as it stands, and it's a pretty plausible theory, you've got to say. That. Whether that goes anywhere, who knows? Clearly, Checo Perez doesn't think so, because Perez was asked the question yesterday, are you going to go anywhere from Red Bull? And he says, no, I'm going to be here next year. I'm going to be here for the Las Vegas Grand Prix in a couple of weeks. And he was asked, like, well, Helmut didn't necessarily say that. And he's like, well, I know that I am secure. Now, sure, might be true, but we know that the sponsors for Perez aren't necessarily so convinced of that, possibly. So, yeah, time will tell whether Perez keeps that seat, but it's not like today was a great day either for Sergio Perez, although he actually looked kind of racy, but it didn't, unfortunately, again, translate into all that much. Now, Helmut Marko also mentioned Isaac Hadjar, who's done well in Formula 2 this year, and to be fair, Hadjar is not someone who was massively on my radar, but no, there was Colapinto, right? So you never really know. There is drivers that you can put in some machinery and they do really well, that adapt very especially well to Formula 1, for example. And Marco says, look, Hadjar was faster than Colapinto in the junior categories. So the argument is there to say, well, do we actually need Colapinto? Yes, he's F1 proven now, but we could just get Hadjar in instead. Now, Sergio Perez was especially not happy with the performance of his Red Bull in Mexico, and it seems like he thought that there was actually a problem in the car somewhere with the brakes or whatever. Now, I will say, Red Bull literally admitted that when Perez started talking about problems in the car, they ignored him because they thought that he was just bad compared to Max. And then all of a sudden, Max started to suffer from the same thing. And then, you know, the rest is history, right? But basically, when Perez started to struggle from Miami onwards, I think even like last year at times, there were, according to Red Bull, at least certain development directions that Perez was not so sure on. Max could handle it. And then it turned out that, yeah, Perez was right on some things. So, but the way that Marco describes it sounds like basically Checo's got his tinfoil hat on, because he says, we examined everything because he thought there were problems with the brakes and the chassis. I think he's even getting a new chassis now to calm him him down, which implies there was nothing wrong with your chassis checker, you're just making things up. Ricciardo said the same thing at the start of the season. I think he got a new chassis for Canada, and he did better because of it. So whether it's a mental thing or whatever, like, he's got a new chassis, the team worked hard on it, and he has an old used chassis for the RB20, but it might be giving him more confidence. He also does have a different floor spec to what Max is using, but Red Bull say that it's very minor, the differences. They don't think it makes much difference, apparently. So, they reckon both cars theoretically are pretty similar performance-wise, and maybe we saw a bit of that today. So, yeah, as Scott Mitchell-Mum actually was the one that said this, that, yeah, Red Bull doesn't think it's a particularly big difference, and Paul Monaghan said if you look at the edge wing itself, it's subtly different, it's a small difference. The magnitude is, I would argue, small enough that it's not going to cause him to have a significant difference to Max. So, Red Bull are judging it on pure pace, as they sometimes do. Now, he will also be looking at the situation, Paul Monaghan, among others, at the junior team. Apparently, they are going to rename it to simply Racing Bulls, which is still a bad name, but it is better than Visa Cash App RB, to be fair. So it was funny to me that RB, when they were called RB, they would always say publicly, oh, it doesn't mean Racing Bulls. Don't know what you're talking about. It just means RB, whatever that is. Although they are like owned or part owned by an organisation called Racing Bulls Spa. So it's all very confusing. But apparently they will be officially called Racing Bulls. The agreements will stay the same, but maybe they will no longer be title sponsors, which is a relatively big deal, because if that's true, that would of course mean less money, you would think. Is Danny Rick involved? Him leaving? Maybe that's part of it? I don't know. The drama continues, by the way, this weekend on driving standards. Juan Pablo Montoya, who knows a fair few things about, how to race great champions and how to be very unyielding and uncompromising, said the following: I thought Lando was going to step up and take Max out. He needs to do that. Max takes the piss on how far he takes things. The only way to stop him is to run him over. So, this is Montoya at his best on some level. Now, of course, the point really being, Max can't afford, or Lando can't afford to take out Max because of the way the championship stands. I guess at some point you can afford to risk it, maybe, and collide with the hope that you survive and he doesn't, I guess. But look, Lando has a points deficit. He can't just take him out. But is Montoya right in principle? Even if you don't necessarily agree with the driving standards and the fairness or whatever that he potentially promotes, Lando has too much respect for him. Way too much respect is what Montoya says, which is not a bad thing. He's a great guy. But if you're racing against Max, who doesn't race fair, you can't make it work like that. Max knows what the rules are and he pushes them. Norris will have to stop playing the victim and show Verstappen that he's willing to crash. Kind of, we're talking Silverstone 2021 vibes, to be honest. But of course, back then, it was earlier in the season, that kind of, retaliation, if you want to call it that, from Hamilton, even if it was that, obviously opinions are divided. But I do think on some level, Hamilton had the intention that weekend to say, look, Max, I'm not going to be pushed around here. Lando, if he wants to do that, he's running a serious risk, because a DNF for Lando is the end of his championship hopes. So, obviously Max has the advantage. He just has to hold on. He has to try his best to prevent Lando from scoring as many points as possible. But today, it was a very well executed day from McLaren, and it puts Max in a position where he's not going to be in front of Lando, potentially at any time this weekend. The only time that he might be in front of Lando during the race on Sunday is if he's coming up to get lapped, which is obviously, well, it's unlikely, very unlikely, but it's not implausible with the way that McLaren looked today. So, new rear wing for McLaren. They have a couple of pieces. McLaren made it clear a while ago they are going all out for the championship. The problem is that from the driver's POV, they didn't go all out early enough, as we full well know. I said at the time, in Hungary, they shouldn't have given Piastri the win. I still stand by that statement. You can argue what it means for team morale and all this stuff, but it was clear in Hungary the championship was potentially on. There have been other moments as well, Monza, for example, where they should have been clearer. And now they find themselves ramming the upgrades with comfortably the fastest car in many respects as of late today, certainly true in qualifying, and will likely be true in the race as well. But Lando still has a 47-point deficit in the championship to Max. However, things go from bad to worse for Max this weekend because today it was confirmed the 5-place grid pen for the new ICE is happening. So that's 6 power unit ICEs that Max has taken this season. Now, the 5-place pen isn't the end of the world. There will be slower cars in front of him that he can overtake, but of course, by the time he does that, or if those drivers don't make it easy for him to do so on the Sunday, that is potentially substantial ground lost in the championship. So let's talk about practice, because this was interesting. 1 hour of practice only, especially for a team like McLaren to get a new upgrade dialed in. Not necessarily going to be so easy, but a circuit that on paper does suit them better than the Red Bull. We know that the Red Bull struggles over curbs and tend to struggle in some of the slower corners too. Ferrari have leveled up there. McLaren have leveled up there especially. The Red Bull really likes the high-speed corners, but Brazil doesn't have that many of those. The first corner, kind of, and obviously up like, turn 5, turn 6, up the hill to the middle sector, that kind of is as well. But apart from that, it is some slower speed stuff and some other corners which are effectively just straights, right, for modern Formula 1 cars. The surface change has been fascinating though, because, well, people are like, it's still bumpy. We don't really still know what the abrasiveness is going to be like. I think the general theory is that it might be easier on the tyres, but as we know, it may well rain tomorrow and on the Sunday as well. The weather is going to play a part, we think, this weekend in some capacity at least. That means higher downforce is generally more preferred, and of course the track surface as well plays a part in that when it's been resurfaced, right? Who knows how it's going to behave under rainy conditions. So teams that have higher downforce will likely benefit in the rain, and that has probably been a part in why some of these teams have gone for slightly higher downforce modes than you might expect during qualifying play today. But still, the McLaren had pretty good top speed. This was FP1. At this time, the Verstappen, obviously they were running mediums because using up too many soft tyres doesn't really work on a sprint weekend with this difficult allocations, especially when for the race on Sunday, if it was to rain, you really want a new set of soft tyres if you can to stick them on as it's potentially drying up hypothetically towards the end of a Grand Prix. So, you know, Max the Mercedes, Alonso was here as well, but that was very short-lived indeed. I don't know what's going on with Aston Martin, but it's a disaster. Newey has his work cut out, to say the very least, because they brought an upgrade, Aston Martin, to Austin, and it just failed miserably. They've now gone back, I think, to Japan's spec, maybe, or certainly a spec from an earlier, and I think it can't be Japan's spec, surely. That was so long ago. Maybe Singapore spec or something. They've gone back to an earlier spec Aston Martin version because their upgrade simply did not deliver. And we've heard that a lot over the last couple of years since their phenomenal 2023 start. But yeah, where McLaren were with respect to Aston a couple of years ago compared to today is rather fascinating. So Lando ends up the session on top, 2 tenths ahead of Russell, and then also 2 tenths ahead of Oliver Bearman in that Haas. What a result. Now, look, it's only practice, so I don't really care much, but we know, like, okay, I believe I know how good Bearman is, watched him for a couple of years, highly rated him even before he was in contention for Formula 1 seat, and it's exciting to see that that's now played out. Bit of British bias maybe in play there, especially because Bearman grew up just down the road from where I grew up, so bit of bias in play, sure, I'll accept it. But I still think that Bearman has the potential to be a quality driver, and we definitely saw it in the Haas today. Now, before we discuss qualifying, I do want to quickly go through some of the long-run data, because this is always quite telling. It's only one practice session, and the Ferraris were running their sims on what we believe was sprint fuel loads, whereas the Red Bulls are running theirs on race fuel loads, but still the delta in performance, again, the Ferraris is only a few laps to be fair, but the Ferraris do seem to have great race pace again. It's just their quali again that suffers. Honestly, Mexico was like an aberration to me because out of nowhere they just gained some tenths and really switched on the soft tyre. Usually they've been 2-3 tenths off pole, but they've been pretty much the fastest race car. Ideally, you've got to have both. That's pretty much what McLaren seemed to have. But yeah, the Red Bulls 1:15.3s for both of the guys wasn't looking great compared to their competition. So that's something to keep in mind, although Piastri was pretty similar at that part of the session as well. Then, obviously, there was talk about power units and the relevance of that as well. But Marco, after the session, said that, yeah, Ferrari ran with the same amount of fuel as we did. They would still be faster. We have problems. The car is either better in fast corners or in slow corners. There's lots of work to do in terms of setup. And, of course, this new RB20, since the upgrade in Austin, has been a better qualifying car than it has been a race car. And today it was not that good in qualifying. I think that's the concern for Verstappen, that maybe in race trim, it's actually just kind of slow. So let's talk about qualifying, right? Of course, it officially gets underway. And as soon as qualifying began, the Astons were just terrible. So Alonso was out, Stroll was out, Zhou was out. Tsunoda, though, knocked out as well. This is a big one for Liam Lawson. We talk about Behrman versus Hülkenberg, but of course, Behrman's got a drive. Lawson doesn't have a drive. He's got a drive confirmed nowhere at all. Even RB for next season have not confirmed Lawson's going to stay, because he might go to the Red Bull seat, of course. Another good result for Gasly, by the way, out qualifying Ocon, I thought. And Behrman, I mean, what a lap, going P6 at the ends, putting a great lap in Q2 as well. So the Haas, like the Toyota Gazoo Haas, has done, like, I'm so happy that they're proving to be a serious force right now in F1. And Hülkenberg and Magnussen and Behrman are all proving that it's a very accomplished car right now. So it's massively exciting to watch this storyline play out. And then we had, again, more Lawson-Perez drama. So Lawson had a bit of an incident on track here with Perez, and it was like, mate, who was that in the Red Bull? Was that Checo or was that Max? And his radio engineer said, don't worry, please, Liam, don't worry about it, which basically is, it was Checo, obviously, because we know that they've had their drama back in Mexico. And in an absolute disaster class for Red Bull, Perez puts in a decent lap, to be fair, but it wasn't anything spectacular. He was looking reasonably comfortable, but then they just sent him out too late. An operational mistake from Red Bull. He didn't, have the opportunity to really go any better. And yeah, ends up P13. And Hülkenberg was out as well. Behrman made it through. Colapinto was out. Pretty notable for his future with Albon making it through. Bottas Q2 appearance. Impressive stuff. And then Hamilton, P11. Hamilton was struggling with the car all day. His long run pace did look pretty damn good. But he was complaining about the bumps in the car, the rear ends not being so stable. And the Mercedes are pretty similar this weekend. But there are slight differences in their setup just on the spec that's actually on the car. There's some trials they're still doing. So, Hamilton in front of his home crowd on some level here in Brazil, not of course happy with that outcome, but we know that Hamilton, he tends to boycott sprint races most of the time by just not delivering in sprint qualifying, and usually in the sprint with the exception of China this year. But yeah, Red Bull sent him out too late. Rare operational error, but it's just tough for Perez. It's a compounding problem. But in Q3 and really throughout qualifying entirely, there was only one man who looked likely to stick it on pole, and that was Lando Norris. But just when it mattered, Oscar Piastri pulled out a lap. And I mentioned this the other day, right? That it seems like the only time that whenever Piastri is ahead of Max, he's also ahead of Lando, right? So whenever Lando needs Piastri to just slot in behind him, hold Max back, it tends to work the other way around. So good bounce back from Piastri here, of course, after some criticism on his weekend in Mexico, and delivers a pole time of a 1:08.9. Lando was 300ths behind, and anyone else was 2.5 tenths off. Leclerc, good lap, P3. Max was 3 tenths off. Sainz was 3.5 tenths off. Then the Mercedes was back 5.5 tenths off. So Lawson ends up P8 ahead of Albon. Behrman didn't get a time in, and then Gasly P7. I mean, you've got to say, Gasly's doing a mega job in that Alpine lately, but it's a 1-2 front row lockout for McLaren for tomorrow. So will Piastri be asked to usher Lando by during the race? Probably, if it's a 1-2 towards the end, when that point might potentially matter. But as Max says, as soon as we went into qualifying, it looked like we were going to be off. The bumpy areas are not good for our car, and if we're off over a lap, we're certainly not going to be the strongest over a race. And of course, on Sunday, he's going to be 5 places back, right? Like if today's Quali P4 is executed on Sunday, Max is going to start, or executed tomorrow night for the Sunday race, Max is going to start P9. And like starting P9 is a serious issue if Lando's just running away with it out front, which he may do. Like that could be another serious point swing. Piastri was asked the question like, what are you going to do? Are you going to swap places? And Piastri's like, right, not for me to say right now. The point is, of course, hold the 1-2. Ideally, let's say Lando gets a great start in the sprint. Does Piastri push him off? You know what I'm saying, right? Like, McLaren have to be very clear that the goal is to be 1-2 by the end of the first lap. Whatever that means, if Lando gets a good start, yields. If Lando doesn't get a good start, hold the position, hold the 1-2. That should be what McLaren are saying tonight. Make sure we finish that 1-2, and then after we get the 1-2, presumably they're going to have good race trim pace. Then they can think about whether they swap the drivers later on. I think that's the way McLaren have to handle it for tomorrow. But there was this image just now spotted with Christian Horner having a discussion with Sergio Perez. And, well, the Mexican driver does not look especially pleased. But very much interested in your thoughts as ever in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoyed. Subscribe if you're new. Take care. And I'll see you next time.